woman in the Bible days. She had been sick so very long. When she heard my Jesus was passing by. Things were segregated back then. I mean, in the theater, for example, the blacks could not sit in the auditorium below. They had to sit in the balcony. And the whites were down on the floor level, so you couldn't go there as a group.
They had on the sign there, colored only, that we had to go up to the balcony to sit. And on one section of the balcony section was where we would sit.
And I wondered how I could teach my daughter to respect those rules and laws. I mean, how I was going to teach I was trying to teach my daughter how she could be anything she wanted to be. She turned out to be an architect. But how could I teach her that she can't use this fountain, she's got to go to this fountain?
It's just, you know, and to this day, my 84, 85 years old, I can't believe that there were such things as it couldn't go to different places here.
You know, it was a very prophetic movement at the time to try and wrestle with this kind of issue. And the general attitude in society was changing too slowly. And this council really served as the official meeting place, shall I say, for discussions.
I got invited to go to a meeting, so I went, and it was, I think, a feeling that things are going to change and should change, and we needed to try to make it go peacefully.
And so with, you know, having me on the board and whatnot as a black, then quite naturally it was exemplifying what this is all about. It was a race relation kind of a board and a situation where we know that people could get along together.
I suppose it was my conscience that drove me. I try to follow my heart when I see an issue. I am that way, and so I saw this as an issue that wasn't right.
Well, I think it was part of our history, part of our beliefs, part of our not wanting to segregate people away from us, you know.
It's hard to imagine how segregated things were, really. If you didn't experience it, it's very difficult to imagine the segregation that existed.
The church was operating not on the basis of what was the accepted practice, but trying to work out what our own principles called us to do. How Mennonite people were wrestling with the race issue, and I think a big part of it came because of our overseas mission work. We were in Africa and different countries, and you couldn't come back here then from that setting and go along with the kind of segregation that was prominent.
There's a phrase or a value we use at the Valley Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center, which is neighborliness. And there's a sense of treating people as a neighbor, encouraging them, identifying with whatever their issues are, kind of standing with them in their struggle.
The human being was a valuable creature, and that all human beings were equal in God's sight,
there was a question, what's the greatest law in the commandment? Well, in the Hebrew law, it was love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your being, sort of thing. And then Jesus added a second one, which was also from Hebrew scripture, love your neighbor as yourself. From the book of Leviticus, which seems to be so ridden with exacting laws, Jesus pulls the gist of that together and say, this is what it means to live in the presence of God and to honor God. You honor the one who's given you being by living not only in praise of this God who creates us, but also who creates everyone else. You love others, you live with them as you would love yourself. A lot of those were religiously started. I mean, their movements weren't just protests against anything. It really grew out of their faith perspective. And some great leaders for that helped to shape that sort of thing. One of the most notable ones, obviously, is Martin Luther King Jr., who himself was a minister. His father was a minister. So in his studies and his theological studies, he was putting this together and trying to think, what's it mean to address the issues that will eventually be determined political?
The initial goals, I think, were to get integration moving. It was too stagnant. Nothing was happening, and we felt we had to do our little bit to get things moving in the right direction.
The schools had shut down in Prince Edward County, which is where we attended schools. And I think I was in the second grade, actually. So probably sometime around that mid-year, our parents, it was basically decided that the schools weren't opening up again that year. So in order for us to attend school, our parents took us back to Harrisonburg.
I was young, very young, so they didn't discuss anything with me. But what I figured was that we were more or less of an experiment to integrate Rockingham County, and Parkview was picked because basically of the Mennonite community, and there were a lot of leading Mennonites behind the move who supported the move. So naturally, we found a house out here, purchased a house, and we moved out here, and the neighborhood was okay with it.
That Mom had Karen in one hand and Charles in the other, and then us, the two of us then, we're just following after her. And, so we walked in that day, and we were met by the principal, and then he was told what grades we needed, how old we were, and we went into the classrooms. But we were just going to school. So, and I don't know that beforehand that we knew that everyone else in the school would have been white, and it was never discussed, and I don't even remember ever even thinking about it.
The Parkview community gave them welcome and friendship, and that was the big part of the Parkview community, because once they were here and admitted to school, then the next question is, social relationships.
She came to our meeting and was a great communicator, and she had a lot of things she wanted to say, and she said them, and she said them well.
She, I'd say she was accepting on both sides, and she was interested because of her children. She knew the story at Farmville, and she was an activist, yeah.
But we had a special end of the hospital in which we, all blacks were placed, and they couldn't be in any other section of the hospital. Yeah, that was one of the, yeah.
One of the early projects was a hospital. The delivery room and the white mother's waiting room were on the same floor, but the black women, their waiting room was on the floor below the delivery room. They used the same delivery room, but they were on the floor below, and facilities were not quite as good, and the whole problem of having to go upstairs to the delivery room and then back down was just, we felt it was foolish. In fact, that was one of our first successes, was that the hospital agreed to integrate the waiting room for delivery. Then the schools were pretty early on. Employment came later, and housing. I'm not sure we made much progress in housing. I was never involved in the housing end of it, but it was more difficult to get a handle on.
Well, I was in education, so I went up for some reason to the school board, which was up in the courthouse. And I saw that that they had restrooms that said colored only and white only. So I went down and went into the office of the County Board of Supervisors, and I walked up to the counter, and there was a big, tall sheriff there. And I said, "This is 1956. That is no longer legal." And the big sheriff looked down on me and said, what do you think you're doing coming in here and threatening people, you know? And I stood my ground, and he kept on me, and I just stood there like I was a brave man. So I left expecting to come to the board meeting the next day, but in a day or so I got a call from this same lady I talked to, and said it's no longer necessary for me to come to see them because they have taken care of the matter themselves.
You know that I'm so glad, Lord. You know that trouble don't last always. Oh, I'm so glad, Lord.
On one hand, I feel that there's been progress made, but in my own gut feeling, I have to say that we're a long ways from the goal. Sorry to say, but that's how I feel.
To make plans for what's going to happen in the future, you need to know what happened in the past. So I think it's very important to know our history.
And they always said that, don't worry, things will get better. And that's true, and it is getting better. And you know, we find that we're given the opportunity to do all the wonderful things that we do. Who would have thought, and I wouldn't have, who would have thought that in the city of Harrisonburg, We have a black mayor, we have a black manager, and then we have a black chief of police in Harrisonburg.
Well, I think it's important because we are shaped by our history. And sometimes today as we study, we're not sure what conditions people's thinking. And we've got to recognize that different families passed on their heritage in different ways. And so the important thing is honesty for communication and conversation with each other. And in that honesty, we don't judge one another, but we understand one another as to where we've come from.
What shall I